Okay, and so continuing with where we left off with social Darwinism, right? If Darwin, who's the famous evolutionary biologist who basically argues that nature rewards biological advantages. Nature rewards fast cheetahs by giving them extra food that makes them more successful in reproducing, and nature punishes slow gazelles because slow gazelles get eaten and die out. Um, that basically this natural selection by nature to reinforce or reward evolutionary advantages started to be applied to human beings, right? Where racist scientific thinkers were using these principles to argue that white Europeans discovered or industrialized not because they got lucky, but because they were superior. They were genetically superior to these poor Indians and Asians and Africans who were basically subhuman. And so, this racism that emerged became sort of the popular narrative that emerged out of this was that Europeans um, of powerful, European nations basically had a responsibility to protect the weaker races from themselves, to civilize them, right? To bring them proper education, healthcare, to bring them Christianity, good government, to basically bring them all the things that Europeans had, right? Never mind that these were thriving, rich societies going back thousands of years that were doing just fine, but basically, if they didn't dress like them, eat like them, pray like them, study like Europeans, that they were doing it wrong. And so, again, this responsibility to civilize these subhuman, weaker races, to the point where imperialism and this mentality of racist imperialism became sort of natural. Right, it was the natural order of things. Right, the stronger races survive and thrive, and the weaker races basically are weeded out, and or if they're not weeded out, they are only there to support and give strength to the strong races. You can see these horribly racist, very extremely offensive ads, but I think really give evidence to what we're talking about of the scientific revolution principles of observation being basically manipulated to support racist ideology. You can see here the image on the left, right? You see on the top left this Apollo, this classic Greek statue, sort of endemic of European civilization and culture. You can see the skull, and then if you look at what is a very obviously racist depiction of a African man, um, you can see here that the skull is looks very different than what the Greek skull looks like. And then you can see what they're really trying to say is look at the skull of a chimpanzee, and they're basically the same. Which always kills me because any critical thinker could look at this ad and say, if you took that skull um, on the middle and you tilted it about 30 degrees downward, it would look identical to the Greek skull, you idiots. Come on. You just need to like shift it down a little bit, rotate it. But, doesn't matter because there's a racist basically ideology or philosophy to peddle here to justify the enslavement of sub-Saharan Africa nations and South Asia and Pacific Islands. Here you can even see where the racism became so permeated in European society that it became harnessed in soap ads. Right? The first step to lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pears soap, a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth. Dark corners, obviously, referring to people with dark skin. There's a real racial implication there. And then continuing with our racist and horribly offensive cartoons that really give evidence to what we're talking about here. We have an image here showing a Chinese man in a very racially inflammatory way. How did the Industrial Revolution alter European powers or imperial powers, rather? We know that prior to this point in history, China had been at the top of the global power pyramid, Middle East, India. All of these places were kind of really running the show for most of human history. But the reality is that with industrialization, the whole power balance shifted. We look at from 1750 to 1900. It's called the second wave of European colonialism, um, which begs the question, what was the first? And the first was clearly, right, the settlement of the Western hemispheres of South America, Central America and North America. But now, America is independent. Most of South America is independent. And so the second wave is really focusing on Asia and Africa. And what followed was a whole slew of new players, new global power players, where fueled by the riches and technological advances of the Industrial Revolution, we saw new world leaders kind of take their place towards the front. Germany, Italy, Belgium, the United States, Japan, Russia comes along a little bit later, in addition to England and France. Um, and we start to see those traditional European powers that were powerful during the first wave fade, right? Spain didn't industrialize early, Portugal didn't industrialize early, and so they were left behind. And as I said, if you were to track who were the earliest industrializers outside of China, it really aligns to the global power balance that's still in place today. The most powerful, richest nations in the world include the United States, Germany, France, England, Japan, Russia, right? These are all the earliest industrializers, and so that move forward and progress and wealth was begun during the Industrial Revolution, but continues to this day. And so, looking at this map by the late 1800s, this is the world. You can see South America is mostly independent. Um, but Africa is completely gobbled up. So is Southeast Asia and South Asia, and the Russian Empire is clearly pretty dominant all across Central Asia. The what was Uzbekistan and all the different stands of Central Asia, but also like the Siberian region. And I think these statistics really show it. Percentage of regions that are controlled by European powers or the US by 1900. 90.4% of all of Africa is controlled by Europeans or the United States, European. Pacific Islands is almost 99%. Asia, which is a giant landmass, 56.5. Um, and so how were these new colonies that, nationalism and industrialization were driving forward? How are these new colonies both gotten and then managed? We know for most of the imperial period, European powers typically preferred a more hands-off, looser, more informal method of control. It was far cheaper to them to control a country informally as opposed to formally, because you didn't have to have an army there, right? You didn't have to build forts. You didn't have to basically control it with an iron fist. You could rule by economic dominance, right? You could basically get hold of the rulers, create taxes, bonus points if your taxes can only be paid in dollars or money that they make from working for you, and so they have to work for you in order to get the money to pay the taxes of your ruling. It's obviously a Disney villain move, but if you can economically dominate, then you don't need to do a total takeover. Cheaper and less likely for rebellion, because if you station a foreign army in India, right, the Indian population, which is huge, is far more likely to rise up, right, and to kick you out. But if the Indians themselves are largely being ruled by the same people that they were ruled, for hundreds of years, only that person now reports to the British, right? Well, there's less to push on. But we did sometimes see that the competition between European powers, the competition, particularly in Africa, would sometimes force direct conquest. We see in Africa, a lot of conflict between the French and the British, who, were oftentimes competing side by side to gather colonies all across sub-Saharan Africa. Um, And, basically, once things got started, it just sort of perpetuated itself. Victories were collected, not just for, the British sending in their armies and, conquering, but basically giving demonstrations of force and saying, if you don't surrender, this is what's going to happen to you, right? You bring a couple Maxim guns, line them up, and show an African ruler that if they don't basically capitulate and sign on, that we're going to basically come in and destroy them. And watch this. And so the threat of military force was oftentimes sufficient. Um, and basically the European military advantage, which had been established over 1,000 years since the fall of Rome, of constant fighting, discipline, organization, really moved into outright firepower domination, where with the Maxim gun and repeating rifles, pretty much Westerners always won. Outside of a couple handful of cases like Thailand in Southeast Asia or Ethiopia in Africa, pretty much the entire continent won. Westerners, the Europeans, always won without fail. Now, if you were Germany or France or Great Britain and you were kind of moving inward on the Congo River, conquering societies, would you rather conquer centralized societies that were, organized around a nice state, nicely, neatly organized, or would you rather conquer loosely decentralized societies of villages ruled by elders that were very little kind of relationship between each other? And the answer is you want the centralized society. You want the established state already, because then all you had to do was basically beat that ruler on open battlefield or get them to surrender, and you got their whole society. Whereas a decentralized society, you had to conquer village by village. But what was happening, particularly in the Pacific and um, and sub-Saharan Africa, was Europeans started to get a little bit worried that the amount of competition that they were experiencing between each other, competing to gather colonies. I want this land. No, we called it first. No, I got it, right? Like that there was worries that all this new firepower, these technological innovations of poison gas and munitions and bombs and guns, was going to fuel a war between European countries. And they looked at it and said, yeah, we're actually pretty nervous that this is going to happen. And so, in an effort to head this off, European powers agreed to meet in Berlin in 1889 for what was appropriately called the Berlin Conference, where basically representatives from European powers um, engaged in a formal partitioning of Africa, a formal dividing, right? A big map of Africa, basically, um, in some sense, like a big negotiation. Well, I'll let you take this piece over here if we take this piece, and then well, that means we get this part over here. And so this formalized what is referred to as the scramble for Africa. It basically divided up Africa in a way that was seen as more orderly and less likely to lead to full on war, which nobody really wanted, right? This is a picture of the Berlin Conference. You can see nothing but white men at a table dividing up and deciding the fates of millions and millions and millions of Africans across a continent, right? If ever there was a meeting of grand racism, it was that, right? A bunch of old white men deciding on the lives and livelihoods and the conditions and who would rule an entire continent's worth of African people. And it went fast, right? You can see the image on the left was Africa really in the mid 1800s. If you look at that map and I asked you to make a generalization of where it seems most European colonies were, you'd look at that and say, well, the coastal regions. Outside of Egypt, Europeans really only were able to conquer the coasts. And then you look within, 50 to 70 years, the entire darn continent has been carved up, um, going to France and England and Portugal and a little bit to Spain and Italy and Germany and etc. And that is it for today. We will pick this up when I see you on Thursday.